Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Ayin Hey. Today's stuff is sponsored by Rachel Chefetz in loving memory of her father, Shragai Cohen, Shraga Fevel ben Abraham ben Sion Halevi, on his 23rd yahrzeit. His mischievous smile, quick humor, dedication of heart and soul to family in Israel, though not always in that order, and amazing wisdom are sorely missed. Today's stuff is sponsored by Dan Kusher. I'm so happy and grateful being here in Israel, learning in real time together with my fellow Dafarettes and Rabbanit Michelle. How the years have flown. Okay, we'll get started today. I'll mention two shirim that I forgot to bring up in class, which is about wolves we talked about. So, Drusat Ze'ev. In yesterday's daf, there's an article about Shuli Mishkan about wolves in flashback. And Alana Stanhain shir all about mixtures, which is the real topic for the next while, about what's this idea about mixtures and sfikot. So also another good shir to be listening to. And there'll be a shir on Gefet, hopefully today, which is actually going to relate to something in tomorrow's daf, which we'll get started on today, but mostly found in tomorrow's daf about a bit of a shir. So we'll mention that at the end of class. Okay, we're going to start with Kodashim b'Kodashim b'Mimino. We'll just review where we ended yesterday. We're in the next case of our Mishna where sacrifices get intermingled, two of the same type. So since they're two of the same type, we can sacrifice them because what's the problem? The Kohen can just say, well, this goes for whoever it was intended for, and that works. But the problem the Gemara brings up is what happened to smicha. You have to do smicha on a korban. Okay, by the way, with smicha, I just want to explain what usually happens. The person puts their hands on, they also do a vidoy. Like if it's a sin offering, for example, they do a confession about what sin they did. There's a issue like which vidoy you do with which ones, and whether maybe shlamim you don't need vidoy, there's a machloket, but you make a certain statement about it. It's a very personal part that has to do, obviously, with the sacrifice. And you can't do that on any other sacrifice, on someone else's. So there's no way to do this. To which they answer, oh, don't worry. Our Mishnah must be only talking about women's sacrifices. Women are not obligated, even if perhaps they can do smicha, which is a whole topic in Nevitzvah, but they don't have to. So in this case, obviously, they just wouldn't. And then we limit this Mishnah completely, this line in the Mishnah, to women only. To which the Gemara is going to question, Aval b'korban anashim lo? Wait, men sacrifices not, so let's just explain again. Men sacrifices, what would happen then? If two men are supposed to bring korbanot, sin offerings, and they got intermingled, or olot, burnt offerings, so what will be, or shlamim, whatever it might be. So what do? We have to leave them to graze. We can't just sacrifice them and say this goes for whoever because of the smicha problem. So we would leave them to graze, they would get blemished, we buy two animals with the money, and then, right, we'd have to take the highest value of both for each of them. Each one would have to pay the value of the highest of the two animals, and they would then buy a sacrifice with that. So Abaye is now going to question this. And he's going to bring a braita where we're going to have to prove two things here. Number one, we're talking about animals. Okay, what we're going to see is that animals that get intermingled, you can sacrifice and not wait till they get blemished. So we're going to have to prove that, number one, the sacrifices here got intermingled when they were still alive. And number two, that we're talking about sacrifices of men. And then we're going to have a difficulty with Rav Yosef. So comes Abaye, prior student of Rav Yosef, and brings up a difficulty against Rav Yosef. Abaye. Korban yachid. An individual korban. Shenitareh b'korban yachid. So again, we're talking about intermingled korbanot, individuals with an individual. Korban tzibur, shenitareh b'korban tzibur. Or a public offering that got intermingled with another public offering. Right? Those are like holiday offerings, things like that. Daily offerings. B'korban yachid, b'korban tzibur, shenitarvu zeh bazeh. Or you have an individual and a public. Okay, any kind of permutation here. What do? So now we have to figure out, we have the blood. We're at the stage of the blood in this braita. We need to know how many times do we put it around the altar. So there's a bit of a debate. Are we talking about sin offerings that got intermingled? Are we talking about burnt offerings? It sort of doesn't really matter. Okay, well, we're not going to focus on this right now. Notain arba matanot mikol echad ve'echad. Okay, but assuming we're talking about one of the offerings that's brought on the outer altar, so you have to do 4 placings of the blood. Okay, let's say it's sin offerings. So sin offerings need 4 placings of the blood on the 4 corners. Right? The other ones, if you remember, need shtayim, shein, arba, 2, which are 4. Okay, so, but let's say they got mixed with chatat, then maybe you would need to do the 4 because maybe it's a sin offering, or maybe we're just talking about sin offerings. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on that part. because it's not really important for our purposes. So now there's going to be a lot of details which also aren't so important for our purposes, and also there's going to be some complication with explaining one of these lines. And a big debate among the Rishonim what exactly is going on here, different versions. Again, it's not so critical for our purposes, so I'll try to just mention it briefly. So we're now going to have three scenarios. So either notein arba matanot mikol echad ve'echad. So we have these intermingled korbanot, whichever ones they are. We do 4 placings of the blood. Okay, let's just assume sin offering. So we do the 4 like you're supposed to do from each cup. In other words, we're assuming we have 2 cups here. 1 cup of blood from one cup of blood from the other. Okay, and we do the blood from each cup on all 4 corners. Ve'im natan matana achad yatsa. This is a halacha based on something we learned much earlier in the Masechet, which is, even though you're supposed to do the 4, if you did only 1, whether it's the sin offering or the burnt offering or the shlamim, 1 is sufficient. 1 covers you. The only time it doesn't, if you remember, is the sin offerings in the inner altar, but then the heichal. But we're not talking about those. Ve'im natan arba. So again, the minimum you have to do here with your 2 intermingled sacrifices is 1 placing with each of them. Okay, so in the beginning we had 8 altogether because it was 4 from each one. Now we say, well, really you could just do 1 from each one, so that would be 2 altogether. Ve'im natan. This is the difficult line. Im natan arba mikulan yatsa. If you did 4 altogether, you're okay. Which kind of sounds like we did 8, right? 2, and now, well, if you did 4, like let's say you did 2 placings from both of them. Okay, why do you need to mention that? If you just mentioned the previous, it doesn't make any sense, right? Obviously, if you could do 2, you could do 4. What exactly it's talking about? Okay, we're going to put that aside because it's not so important, but there is a big debate about how exactly to read this line. Okay, now, here comes the big line. So far, we haven't proven it's talking about men's sacrifices, and we haven't proven it's talking about when the animals got intermingled when they were alive, because we're in a much later stage now, after it was slaughtered and the blood is mixed. So the blood could be mixed for various reasons. Let's just play out the scenarios. Either we had korbanot that got intermingled when they were alive, which is our case. They slaughtered the animals and now we have no idea which is which. Okay, that's a reasonable one. Or the animal died. The animals weren't mixed yet. We slaughtered them each for what they were supposed to be done. We have the blood from one animal and the other animal, okay? And then we get confused which blood goes with which animal. Okay, that you can imagine kind of reminds me of like the Shlomo HaMelech story with the women and their babies got confused, right? Didn't get confused because they were one unit, right? They got confused because we didn't remember who was who. Okay, now, then the Gemara says like this, and this is the key line for Abaye. Bameh dvarim amurim shenit'arvu chayim. We're talking about not scenario 2, where we got confused which was which, but scenario 1, where they were alive and they got confused. Aval nit'arvu shchutim, but if they got mixed up after they were already slaughtered, now here's a little tricky, because after they were slaughtered, there's 2 possibilities. Either, like I said, like the babies got switched, the bloods got switched, or the blood all ended up in 1 cup from both animals and it got really mixed. Okay? And that's actually the one we're going to see right now. Okay? And you'll see later why I'm setting this up as 3 cases. Okay? Because after slaughter could be case A or case B. After slaughter could be we don't know which blood is which, or after slaughter could be and the blood somehow ended up in the same cup and they're really mixed. So now, if nitarvu, and in this case is obviously that second case, because in nitarvu shchutin, if they were, when they were slaughtered, noten arba matanot mikulan. So now mikulan means from all of it, meaning the one mixture you have. You have 1 cup. So now you do 4 placings from that 1 cup, and that covers both. Why does it cover both? Because minastam, right, when you pour the blood or put your finger in or whatever it is and get the blood, you're going to have some from both. So all you have to do is 4 from both, and you're going to cover both your obligations. So instead of 8 now, all you have to do is 4. And if you only did 1 from that 1 cup, you're yosei also, because all you really need is 1 from each, and you've got 1 from each by doing that 1 placement. Rebbe's totally not related to what we need, but anyway, we're reading it because it's in the braita. In this case, the second case, you have to really look at it carefully. What's in the bowl? If you have enough of a requisite amount for each one, meaning if you have a few droplets of blood and it wouldn't have been enough to do all four corners from one korban, if you split this in half, right, you have to have enough from each korban, or enough that it could have been enough from each korban in that cup. So even though all you need is to do 4 placings, but if you didn't have enough to do 8, then you can't do it. Okay, you have to at least potentially be able to do that. Okay, even though you don't actually have to do 8, but you have to have enough to do 8. V'imlav psulan. If not, it doesn't work. Okay, what does Abaye want to prove from here? Well, we proved that it's alive. When they're alive, they got mixed, and we still sacrifice them. Okay, that's clear because it says nitarvu chayim, right? The first whole scenario, those 3 options of what you could do if you had 2 cups, was all the braita says when they were confused, when they were still alive, and then you went ahead and sacrificed them. Okay, but where did it say men? Well, katana yachid dumiyad tzibur. Well, it talks about individual and it talks about communal. Now, mat tzibur gavre. Now, since the tzibur ones are males who are obligated in the public sacrifices, there's men involved there, right, that are right to everybody. Af yachid gavre. So since those relate to the men, we assume the individual ones relate to men as well and could be owned by men. And therefore, the assumption is this is talking about men. So now we have a problem because it's talking about men and it seems like they can get mixed even when they're alive and we still go ahead and sacrifice them, and that goes against Rav Yosef. So Amar Rava. Rava says, V'tizbera, you really think that's the way to read it? Ha mitaratztahi. This whole braita doesn't make any sense, or part of this braita doesn't make any sense. Because, okay, I'll tell you outside for a minute before we read it inside. If you figured out they're alive versus they're slaughtered. Those are the 2 scenarios. But like I said before, there's really 3 scenarios. It's not really the difference between alive and slaughtered. What's the difference between case 1 and for section 1 and section 2 in the braita? 1 cup or 2 cups. And 1 cup could happen, right? You could have, after they're slaughtered, we already said there could be 2 scenarios. Either you have 2 separate cups still, and we just don't know which is which, or you have only 1 because they got mixed. So, and the real difference in the Mishna is do you have 2 cups or 1 cup, and the braita is do you have 2 cups or 1 cup, which means that something doesn't jive here in the braita. Why did the braita say alive and slaughtered? It should have said 2 cups or 1 cup, right? That's the real difference. So he says, the katani, this is what's bothering him. The difference in the braita has nothing to do with were they mixed when they were alive or were they mixed after they were slaughtered. The real difference is 2 cups or 1 cup. So that's not, then your bamed varim amurim is really not correct then. So what does he do? He interprets the bamed varim amurim, what is this case referring to, differently. He says chayim doesn't really mean alive, okay? Even though normally chayim means alive. Elahachi kamar. What it really means to say is like this. Bamed varim amurim, in what case are we talking about? Shenit arvu shchutin ke'en chayim. They were mixed after they were slaughtered, like as if when they were still alive. Meaning, what's the only way animals could get mixed up when they're alive? Like the children, right? Like the babies. We just don't know which is which. Same, and that's what we're talking about in case number 1. We have 2 cups. Why do we have 2 cups? Because we're not sure which is which. It's like the way they could get mixed when they're alive. Aval bibolel, but the second case, it says shchutim, what it means is if after they were slaughtered, the blood got all mixed together, and then we have only 1 cup. In which case, we've removed entirely the fact that this braita is talking about when the animals got mixed up when they were alive. Because alive just means after they were slaughtered, the blood got mixed up in the only way it could have gotten mixed up if they got mixed up when they were alive. But it's not actually talking about that, right? And then just continue and they'll explain. Okay, and then they just finish up the words of the braita. That's what would happen if they got mixed up. Then they'd be in 1 cup. And again, the only difference is 2 cups, 1 cup, and not alive and dead. So once we say that this braita is not talking about when they're alive, this has nothing to do with Rav Yosef, and we could still retain Rav Yosef's answer that the Mishna is only talking about women. If it were men, the halacha would be different. Before we get to the next sugya, though, we already mentioned Rebbe's position. The Gemara wants to deal with Rebbe and raise difficulty against Rebbe from something else he said, which seems to contradict his opinion in the braita. His opinion in the braita, if you remember, is you have to have enough of a requisite amount of blood in order to sprinkle the blood. Even though you don't actually need all that blood, you don't need to do 8 placings, but you need to have enough that you could theoretically do 8 placings of blood. So Rebbe Omer, we're just going to quote this, okay, it has to have enough for each one. Umi ile Rebbe high spirit. Does Rebbe really hold this way? Vehatanya, it says in a braita, I'm a Rebbe. Rebbe says, L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, he starts off and he says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, we're now turning to Abaye, Haza'a kol shehu mitaheret. This is talking about not blood. This is talking about sprinkling of the para aduma waters, the red heifer waters. When you sprinkle the red heifer waters to purify someone, any amount, there's no requisite amount, any amount works. Because sprinkling does not require any requisite amount. You just sprinkle a little and that's fine. This sentence is missing a lot of words, okay? But it means if you have a sprinkling where the mechatat, half of it is mechatat, and half of it is extra water that was added to it after, which isn't mechatat, and it's disqualified from being mechatat. But if you sprinkled from that mixture, just like we said with the blood, because we assume anything you take out of there has a combination of everything, then you have kosher mechatat waters in there. And if you sprinkle on the person, since there's no required requisite amount, that's fine, it works. Okay, even though there's extra water in there, which doesn't work, but since you're sprinkling from the combination, whatever you sprinkle works. Okay, what's the main problem here? It's a little bit of a jump. But since Rebbe says that haza'ah, sprinkling the red heifer waters, doesn't have any requisite amount, we assume, big assumption, that he would say the same thing about blood. The blood also doesn't need a requisite amount. Okay, that's right now the assumption. So we have 2 very easy answers here to resolve this apparent contradiction between Rebbe and himself. Lidvarav to Rabbi Eliezer Kamar. First of all, the first words were, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the haza'ah doesn't have a requisite amount. So you could say, maybe he doesn't hold that way. He was just telling us, you should just know that Rabbi Eliezer holds this way. But who's to say he holds this way? That's one way to resolve it. V'bai de'ema, which I kind of already got you to think about this, haza'ah l'chud u'netina l'chud. You probably thought of it yourself also. What's the connection between haza'ah needing a requisite amount of the paraduma waters and placing of the blood on the altar? Who's to say that what's true for one is true for the other? And with that, we finish the first sugya today. Okay, so we're going to review this part right now and not review at the end of daf. Okay, so here's our review because it's very straightforward. We started with a case in the Mishna, Kochim, but Kochim got mixed up. We said, but what happened to smicha? We said, just right, Rav Yosef said, just women. The Mishna is only just women. If it were men, you'd have to leave them to graze till they got blemished, etc. Abaye says, how could you say that? Here's a braita that says they're alive. And we assume they're talking about sacrifices of men, and the animals got mixed up when they were alive, and we could still go ahead and sacrifice them. We don't have to wait till they get blemished. To which we said, that didn't really mean alive. Okay? That braita wasn't talking about really alive. It meant 1 cup versus, 2 cups versus 1 cup. 2 cups is the only way they could get mixed up if they were alive, and that's why it said alive. It meant after they were slaughtered, but the kind of mix-up you could only have when they're alive. And then we just had this side thing about Rebbe, where he seems to contradict himself from his opinion he said there about requisite amounts, and we resolved it. Okay, next case in our mission. Nitarvu b'bchor uvemasir. So if you go back to Ayin Aleph Amud Bet, so we're back to the Mishna. The Mishna says, if kodshim, sacrifices, got mixed up with a bechor or a masir, an animal tithe or a bechor, what happens with those? Those have to be brought as sacrifices, okay? But once they're blemished, okay, first of all, you can never redeem them, even after they're blemished. Once they're blemished, so the bechor has to go to the Kohen, no matter what, okay? And the Kohen sacrifices it, or if it's blemished, the Kohen eats it. The maaser, you have to bring it as a sacrifice, but if it's blemished, then you get to just slaughter it and eat it regular. Same with the bechor. Now, there's certain rules, though, about bechor. Even once it's blemished, you can't work it, you can't shear it. Okay, same for maaser. And we're going to see you can't weigh it to sell. Like if you want to do something, well, we're going to see like what you might do with it, but it can't get weighed like in a butcher shop. So if you were to sell it for any reason, you would sell it, okay? You would just sell it by estimate, okay? Which is, by the way, going to cause you a loss of money because no one's going to go by estimate and pay you more than what it might be. So you're going to lose money on this if you're selling it. It's just an important point, and there's some limitations on it. So now we're going to have two questions of Rami Bar Chama about Bechor. And the second one, we're going to try to answer the question using our Mishna. And that's why this sugya is brought. So the first thing really doesn't have much to do with anything except that it has to do with the firstborn. But it's really here to tell you the second question of Rami Bar Chama. They must have been a set of questions, or they put them together to remember them, but he asked this, and then he asked this question. And the second question, we're going to try to bring a proof from our Mishnah to get to an answer. It's not going to be successful. So I'm a Rami Bar Chama. Really, he asked here. Bechor lebeit Shammai, ein machilin lenidot. Okay, this is a whole different thing. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel have a debate in Masechet Bechorot, which we'll get to a few Masechtot. It says about a Bechor, and one other thing about a Bechor, when it becomes blemished, it says that anyone can eat it. So even though the Bechor goes to the Kohen, it's the possession of the Kohen, but anyone can eat it, and anyone means not just anyone, okay, you have to be a Kohen, but also even if they're impure. It says, HaTahor v'hatamei yachdav, okay, it says in the Pasuk, impure and pure people can eat it. But Beit Shammai holds, it depends what kind of impurity you have. He says the impurity that allows you to eat it is an impurity that comes from the outside, like you were tamei sheretz from a creature, or you were tamei tumat mate. Okay, even though that's usually severe, but it does have a leniency because it wasn't something from your body. If you're a nida or a zava or a zav, where you have a discharge from your body, that's a higher level tuma that you're not going to, according to Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel says you can't. Beit Shammai says that's not the tamei referred to in this pasuk. Okay, so that's just a fact. But here comes his question. Tmurato mahu. Now, if you're bechor, most of the commentaries think, although there's debate about this, that we're talking about a blemish bechor. After it has a blemish, and you can eat it. Now, you can't eat it if you're in nida, okay? But what if you did a tamura? What's a tamura? You said, I'm replacing this bechor with another korban. Now, it's a weird tamura because it's no longer a sacrifice. It's blemished. It can't be brought as a sacrifice. On the other hand, a bechor has inherent sanctity to it. So the laws of tamura apply. Like, does it have enough inherent sanctity, even though it's blemished, for your tamura to be effective? Remember, you can't, I'm going to always repeat this every time I say tamura because it's a very confusing thing. You're not allowed to do tamura, but it is effective when you do it. So you can't say, I'm replacing the tum of this bechor onto this other animal. You can't replace it. The bechor remains with its sanctity, especially bechor, because it was sanctified from the womb. But it's all the more so now you've actually been able to transfer the kedusha, though, to the other animal, and usually we say the laws are the same. So if we say the laws are the same, then theoretically the laws should be the same. And therefore, the tamura should also not be allowed to be eaten by a nida. But the question is, since it can't be brought as a sacrifice anymore, maybe the tamura is not really effective. And second question, these are all one long question. Bechor non ifdeh, you can never redeem a bechor. So that says so in the Torah. Tamurato mahu. But what if you did the tamura? Can you redeem it? Can you redeem the sanctity of the tamura onto a different animal? Bechor non ishkal b'litcha. Bechor cannot be weighed to sell. Tamurato mahu. What about its replacement? Okay? So now, you can sell a bechor. What does it mean you can't redeem it then? You can't redeem it, meaning the sanctity will always stay on the bechor. So you can't redeem it. Redeeming it means I'm moving the sanctity onto something else. You could sell it, but you sell it as a bechor. Whoever gets it has to treat it as a bechor. So when you sell it, you can't weigh it. What if you did a tamura to this bechor? Can you weigh the tamura? Amar Rava, Tanya bechor ma'aser mishu mamu, osim tamura, utmuratan kayotze behem. Rava has a very simple answer. This is going to be much easier than the next sugya, which is, it says in the braita, a bechor and a ma'aser, that once they become blemished, it doesn't matter. Adayin, they're osim tamura. They still can create a tamura. They still have enough sanctity, inherent sanctity, to make a tamura effective, and their tamura has the exact same laws as they do. So there's your easy answer. Okay, obviously Rami bar Chama didn't know that braita. By Rami bar Chama, second question. Hitpis bechor lebedek Abaye. If I decide that I'm taking my bechor, okay, I'm a Kohen, I have a bechor, it's mine, and I decide, you know what, I want to give its value to the temple. Ma'u shish kol belitra. So now, let's say I take the value of another animal, and I give it to the bedek. Well, actually, what they're asking now is, sorry, I didn't say that right, the last part. I want to take this animal and give it to the bedek Abaye. What do I have to do that? Well, I want to give its value in the end to the bedek Abaye. I'm not actually giving the animal, right? They don't need the animal for temple maintenance. They need money. So I'm going to give them money. Now, how do I evaluate the value of the animal? Usually I would weigh it, right? And if I don't weigh it, there's going to be a loss. So now we have a conflict of interest because, okay, we're going to read it out loud here. Ravcha dehekdesh adifa. Will we rather give the temple the maximum that we can give it and therefore allow it to be weighed? O dilma ziluta de bechor adif. Or do we say, well, we can't. Now, by the way, again, the commentaries say, we're assuming we're talking about a bechor that's blemished, but still it has sanctity to it and we're not allowed to weigh it. And it's going to cause disrespect for this bechor, which has sanctity. So we're pulled in two different directions. And which one is adif? Which one is stronger? Which one outweighs? On the one hand, we want to always weigh things for the temple to maximize how much money we give to the temple. On the other hand, we don't want to weigh it because it's disrespectful to the bechor. So which one wins out? Amar Yosef bar Zveda. Tashma, let's learn from our Mishna. Nitarvu bebechor v'maser yiru ad sheyistavu v'yechalu kebechor v'maser. So if we have bechor, okay, let's ignore the maser for now. That's mixed with a regular korban ola, let's say. We leave it to graze till it gets a mum. We take the value of the most expensive animal, right? We give it to the temple treasury, right? We give it to the, right, we bring it as a sacrifice. And yachlu kebechor uchemaser. And what's left is eaten like the bechor and the maser, right? They all have the law of the bechor and the maser. Now, what does it mean they have the law of bechor and maser? Lav l'meimer de'eno nishkal belitra. Now, if this is all treated as bechor and maser and the stringencies of that, then wouldn't you say, when we figure out the value of this animal that has to go for a sacrifice, which is going to the temple, we can't weigh it because it says you have to treat these all as if they might be bechor. They're treated like bechor. You can't weigh them. So even though we have to bring a sacrifice to the temple, and theoretically you'd think it could be weighed, but it seems to say in the Mishna it can't be weighed. So that's his proof. I guess you can't weigh it. And we err on the side of giving the sanctity to the bechor, the proper treatment of it, and not weigh it. But Rav Huna, Rabbi Chizkiah, Talmidei Rabbi Yirmiyah, right? Okay, Rav Huna and Rav Chizkiah, the students of Rabbi Yirmiyah. This is not the regular Rav Huna. Usually when Rav Huna is mentioned stam, it's the Rav Huna that we know of. He wasn't a student of Rabbi Yirmiyah, so must be some other Rav Huna. There were actually a lot of Rav Hunas. Midami said, these are not comparable. Hatam shtek dushot ushne gufim. Now when it comes to two bodies, meaning you have two sanctities, you have two different sacrifices, Ola, let's say, and Bechor, that got mixed up, and two Gufim, and they're two different animals. So one is definitely a Bechor, and because of that, you can't sacrifice the sanctity of the Bechor for the sake of the Korban, because they're two separate animals. But Hacha, Shtik Dushot, V'Guf Echad. But here, it's the same animal. And that same animal has the conflict. In other words, in our conflict, it's tarovot, and we have to be stringent for the most stringent, that maybe it's this one, maybe it's that one. So we can't say, it might be a sacrifice and owed to the temple, but on the other hand, it might be a bechor, and therefore we can't allow it. This one, it's definitely a bechor that's also sanctified. It's not, right? And the other one, maybe it's a bechor, maybe it's a korban. So that conflict, we're stuck, and we can't undo the bechor element. But in this case, it's one animal that's being pulled in two different directions. It's a bechor, but it's also sanctified. So maybe we're better off. In that case, you might actually be able to say, since it's the same animal, maybe we could weigh it in order to give more to the temple. So we don't have an answer yet. Matkifla Rav Yosef bar Avin. Rav Yosef bar Avin questions the question. He attacks Rav Yosef, he says, what kind of a question are you asking? Latpis bechor lebedek Abaye, right? If you're taking its value to the bedek Abaye, well, ma ilu amal havduli bechor shitpiso lebedek habayit klum shomin lo. If someone had said, redeem me this animal, and I'm going to give its value to the temple, would we allow this? Right? Of course not, because you can't do pidyon, right? So if that's the case, then how could you even think that it would be permitted? And as you can't, what he's basically saying is, since you can't redeem it, what does it mean to redeem? I told you, it means to take away the sanctity of the bechor. Now, since you can't redeem the animal even to give to the bedek habayit, obviously the sanctity of the bechor is more important than the bedek habayit. The fact that it can't be redeemed, right? And you can't take away that. So why would you think if I say I'm giving its value to the temple, that would actually allow us to all of a sudden remove the sanctity and allow it to be weighed? To which the Gemara said, you're comparing redeeming it to giving its value to the temple. Those are two completely different things. Hafdu, how could you talk about redeeming? Rahmana Amar lo tifteh. The reason why redeeming it doesn't work is because the Torah said don't redeem it. So of course not redeeming it wouldn't work, and you couldn't remove the sanctity of the bechor. But here we're talking about something different. We're talking about something that is allowed. The Kohen could say, I'm giving the value of this animal to the temple, and then we're back to the conflict, and it's not clear. So basically, he's saying it is possible there's a question, and it is theoretically possible that we could redeem the sanctity. You can't learn it from redeeming it, because redeeming is completely forbidden. And this is actually permitted, so again, we're back to the conflict, and he explains the question again. Ela Amar Rabbi Ami, but comes Rabbi Ami and says, Klum hiknezeh ela masha kanoilo. He said, when the Kohen, something very, very profound or makes a lot of sense, maybe is a better way to say it. When the Kohen sanctifies this animal. Now, what does the Kohen sanctify? When you sanctify something to the temple, all you can sanctify is what you have and what is yours of that, in this case, animal. So what rights does the Kohen have to this bechor? Well, he can eat it. He can sell it by estimate, not by weighing. So when he says, I'm giving its value to the temple, the only thing he could give of it is the same value that he had. So if his value was, I can give this, I can sell it to someone by estimate, then what he gave to the temple is what he could sell by estimate. So you can't say, I'm going to undo the sanctity of the bechor for this reason because I don't want the hekdesh to lose. Hekdesh isn't losing anything. The hekdesh is getting exactly what he had, which is the ability to sell it by a value, by estimate, and not by weighing it. So in the end, we end up answering this question that you can't. Okay, when it says Ela Amar Rabbi Ami, it does seem to imply perhaps that the one who responded to the question, Rav Yosef bar Avin, thought that maybe you could weigh it, because he was saying don't compare it to redeeming, right? So it's possible there's a machloket here. It's two possible ways to read the sugya, or maybe he just didn't answer, he was just rejecting the question or answering the question. Okay, now we're up to the next case in the Mishna, the very end of our Mishna. Kol yicholim litavev. All animals could become intermingled other than the chatat and the asham. Why? Because the chatat is a male. I'm sorry, the chatat is a female animal, or a female. Usually, it could be a seir, which we'll talk about in a minute, a male goat, but usually it's a female animal. And the asham is always a male ram. Okay, which a ram it's really like a sheep that's a 2-year-old sheep. Okay. So, Mishna chatat v'asham, the high zachar v'hai nekeva. What's the difference between the chatat and the asham? Generally, one's male, one's female. Chatat v'ola nami. So, chatat and ola also. The chatat is almost always brought with a female animal, and an ola is only brought with a male animal. So, there you could also say they don't intermingle. Everyone knows the difference between male and female animals. So, they say no, because ika seir nasi. There is a seir that's male, as I said, which is the goat, right? The seir is imachad l'chatat that we have in all the holidays and Rosh Chodesh and all that, and the seir of the nasi. Okay, so even in individual offering, we have the if the nasi sins, they have to bring a seir. So chataf asham nami ika seir nasi. Wait, if you're saying it could be male, then you're saying you could confuse the chatat and the asham then, because male goat, male sheep, right? Male ram, you could confuse them. So the Gemara says, of course you wouldn't confuse those two. Hai se'al v'hai tzemer. Okay, the ram has wool and the goat has hair. You wouldn't confuse those two. They look very different. So maybe they're both male, but you can identify the difference between them. Okay, another question. Pesach v'asham nami lo ma'arev. Well, then Pesach and Asham would be another good example. Why? Hai ben shana v'hai ben shtei shanim. So the Pesach is brought with a keves, right, a sheep or a lamb. We usually call it the Paschal lamb, but it could be brought with sheep, minak v'simu minezim, if you remember. And the Asham is very similar. It's also in the same family. It's just, but they're different because one is 1 year, one is 2 year. You should be able to identify the difference between a 1 year and a 2 year. So why are those not considered cases that can't intermingle? And the Mishna doesn't mention that. So we're going to have a few possible reasons. 2 answers. Ika Asham Nazir v'Asham Mitzora. There are 2 Korbanot Asham, just like we said, there is a Korban Chatat that's male. So there's a Korban Asham Nazir and Asham Mitzora, which are actually year-old animals and not 2 year. Or Yibayit Ema, the obvious, which is Ika ben Shana de Mechse Ka ben Shtei Shanim, Ika ben Shtayim de Mechse Ka ben Shana. Okay, I would have said, I can't necessarily identify the difference between a 1 year or a 2 year old, but the way the Gemara says it is, sometimes you have a 2 year old which looks like a 1 year old, or a 1 year old that looks like a 2 year old. Okay, what ages, right? It's very relative. So you could imagine that people would confuse the ages, and therefore that's not a defining difference. That would say, oh, there can't be cases where they would intermingle and you wouldn't be able to identify the difference. This, by the way, is a very similar sugya to the one we ended with yesterday about the treifa. Right? They're trying to say, right, what cases would you be able to identify within a mixture and this wouldn't be a mixture? And what cases would you not be able to? Okay, new Mishna. Asham shenitarev b'shlamim. Now we have 2 different types. And now we get to, okay, what happens if an asham and a shlamim intermingle? Now there's different laws for an asham and a shlamim. Rabbi Shimon omer, shnehem yishachatu b'tzafon. So you can go ahead and slaughter them and do it in the north, because the asham is kosher kodshim, has to be done in the north. The shlamim doesn't, but maybe it's an asham, so we have to go with the stringencies of both. V'ye'achlu kechamor shebehen. And they have to be eaten like the more severe one. Remember, there's different laws. How many days can the sacrifices be eaten? Shlamim can be eaten for a day and a night and a day, right? 2 days, really, and the night. And the asham can only be eaten for that day and that night. So when that night kicks in, you have to eat it by then, okay? And if not, what do? It's notar. You have to destroy it. Amrulo, the rabbi said to Rabbi Shimon, Ein mevi'im kodeshim lebeit psul. Here's the big machloket. Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. Are you allowed to create a situation where you might have to burn something and disqualify kodshim? Because comes Rabbi Shimon and says, yeah, if you have an asham and shlamim, go ahead, sacrifice them, and you'll have to burn it the next morning if you leave it over. Even though it's possible it's a shlamim and you can actually eat it. So the rabbis say, how can you create a situation where you're actually going to cause something to be disqualified when maybe it's not disqualified and you're going to burn sanctified items? Again, we have 2 things pulling at us. One is we got these 2 things mixed up and we want to go ahead and sacrifice them. On the other hand, if you do that, you're going to basically potentially, right, definitely, because you have 2 animals, you're now going to say both of these animals can only be eaten for the night and day, for the day and the night, sorry. You're going to have to burn them by the morning when one of them is definitely a shlamim and doesn't need to be burned by the morning. Now, you're not going to definitely have to burn them, only if you don't eat them. That's why you can see why Rabbi Shimon has some logic to just make sure to eat it, right? Eat it in time and you won't have a problem. But the rabbis say there's bad ramifications coming out here, which is you might have to burn kodshim, and we don't want to allow you to burn kodshim. So, and that's this line, Ein mevi'im kodeshim lebeit psul, which comes up a lot. You can't bring kodshim and actively disqualify them. Okay, but in the case where, now that's only if so let's spell it out. What would the rabbis say then? The rabbis would say, don't slaughter these animals. What do? Leave them to graze till they get a blemish, sell them, sacrifice, right? Take the value, buy new animals, one for asham, one for shlamim, and then you won't have this problem. So that's what the rabbis want to do. But let's say they were slaughtered already, and they weren't confused. Everyone knew which was the chatat, everyone knew which was the asham, but now you have some slabs of meat around, and you don't know which meat is which. You could see that would be a confusion, right? People would get confused. Kodshim kalim. Okay, so I'm thinking of this funny example where happened last night. We had a Thanksgiving dinner at my house, and we have vegans and vegetarians, and my mother made stuffing, and some was put in the turkey, and some was left out of the turkey but had eggs in it, and some didn't have eggs to make everybody happy, so it had signs by it, right? But you could see they all looked exactly the same. So there was no way to know which was in the turkey and his meat, had the eggs, which did. So you could see, right, these things, they all look the same, even though they're completely different. Anyway, so the chatichot get mixed up. Kodshim kodshim b'kodshim kalim. So we have higher sanctity, lower sanctity. Hanechalim l'yom echad b'nechalim l'shnei yamim v'layla, right? You have different amounts of time that they can be eaten. Yachlu kechamor shebahem. Now, in this case, the rabbis have no choice. They can't say, you can't bring things to be disqualified. They've already gotten mixed up. In other words, they were already... In the case where they're alive, we always have a solution. Leave them to graze and turn them in. Same with the smicha issue, right? But once the blood is already there, like in the previous, right, there's nothing to do about it. They're mixed already, right? They're done, and you can't help it. Now we're going to start with this braita, and that's going to lead us to a whole long sugya of tomorrow's daf, although I should say tomorrow's daf is very short. It's about, I think it came out to 22 minutes. So, but it is a long section on this, and it is Tana kamei de Rav. So Tana brings a braita in front of before Rav that says the following: Shvi'it ein lokim b'dameha truma mipnei shemema'atin ba'achilata. So if you have, okay, now you have to learn something else. Shemitah produce. Shemitah produce, if you sell it, now you're not supposed to sell it like in the market, but if you sell a little bit of it in a way that can be sold, the money has the sanctity of the fruits that the fruits had. So the money has sanctity. What does it mean, sanctity of Shvi'it? So there's certain things that are limited. One of the things are you have to burn it, you have to get rid of it by the time Bior comes. Meaning, once you can't eat it in the fields anymore, you have to get rid of it. It says the Shemitah produce is for you to eat and for your animals. So as soon as your animals can't eat it, you can't eat it either. So if I have Shemitah produce in my house and then there's no longer on the trees, I have to get rid of it. Meaning I have to eat it before then. If not, I have to destroy it. If I take money that I got from selling the Shemitah produce, it also has to be, if I use it and buy something, I have to also eat that within the time frame. So therefore, if I have money that has Shemitah, that was, let's say, I sold Shemitah produce, I now have the money, and I go to the store to buy things, I'm limited in what I can buy, says this braita. Ein lochim truma, do not buy truma. Because if you don't eat the truma in time, you'll have to destroy truma. And just like we don't want to destroy kachim, we don't want to destroy truma. So don't eat it because this has a clock ticking on it until when you're going to be able to eat it. Because mima'atim ba'achilata, because you're now limiting how long you can eat that truma for. Okay, this is a statement that's going to come up in a braita, in a Mishna, in Maser Sheni, and on that there's a big machloket in the Yersaot, and that's the whole shir of Rabbani Yel Shimoni for, it's going to go up hopefully later. Amarua Rabbanan kamei de Rava. So the rabbis brought this braita in front of Rava and said, Hadalo ke Rabbi Shimon, this must not be Rabbi Shimon. Why? Obviously, because the Ika Rabbi Shimon, Hamar Mibiyim Kodeshim Lebeit Apsul, he has no problem of bringing Kodeshim Lebeit Apsul. When these two things got mixed up, right, he says, go for it. Okay, so you'll have to limit it. What's the problem? Amar Lehu. But here comes the big statement of Rava, which is going to be the whole next sugya. Amar Lehu afilu teimu Rabbi Shimon. I can explain this braita according to Rabbi Shimon also, because hani mile diavad lechatchila lo. When Rabbi Shimon said you can bring things to Beit Apsul, he only said it if it's post facto, b'diavad. He didn't say it if it's lechatchila. You can't create a situation and where, okay, I'm going to the store. I have a choice. I could buy truma with it. I could buy regular produce. Can't say, oh, I'll buy truma. Who cares that I'll bring it to Beit Apsul? He doesn't think that. Okay, now in the case where they got intermingled, you call that b'diavad. Okay, we're going to talk about this later. But is that b'diavad or not? But basically, right now, forget our Mishna. We have this discussion, and come the rabbis and say this obviously doesn't match Rabbi Shimon. He says, of course it does. Because Rabbi Shimon would never think that lechatchila you could create a situation. And that's the next question. Lechatchila lo? Really not? Eitvei Abaye, we're going to have Abaye, Rav Yosef, we're going to have 4 difficulties on this from sources that we're going to see to say, of course Rabbi Shimon says lechatchila you can. And we'll see. Some of them will be resolved, some of them will be semi-resolved, but Rava has this opinion that Abaye and Rav Yosef go against him and say, what are you talking about? How do you understand Rabbi Shimon in that way? Okay, so let's review the second part of today's daf. We had the Bechor and the Maser, which led us to 2 questions of Rami Bar Chama about Bechor that had a mum and either Tmura, right? Or you want to sanctify it to the Bedek Habayit. For the second one, we tried to answer it using our Mishna, and that's why this whole sugya was brought. In the end, we couldn't. We answered it some other way. And then we got to those are the only two things that can't get confused, that can't become intermingled. Tried to suggest maybe other ones, but resolved those as well. And then we started this next mission with the machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, about a very basic machloket. Are you allowed to create a situation where you're bringing something lebeda psul? And then the question becomes, Rava versus others, is it only b'di'evet that he said this, or does he even think at lechatchila, ab initio, that you could do this? With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.